Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's always worrying when the master ceremony starts the introduction by talking about failures that you're going to have to learn from. So we'll see how this goes. Anyway, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to give you this talk on being on the path to leadership. What I'm about to say is derived from a paper that I wrote in 2018 called Being on One's Way, The Path to Leadership, which was published that summer in the International Journal of Appreciative Inquiry. I think some of what I'm going to say will be somewhat controversial, I hope, and provoke further conversation this evening. Many of you here work in learning, I hope, or in leadership, or have some connection to leadership development stuff, and I think I want to provide a perspective about how to position and think about some of that. So having worked and my paper's a little bit long, I have to read some of it, and I'll try to tell a story or two, but I do have to read some of it. Having worked in the learning and leadership development field for over 25 years, much of that alongside thought partners in business schools, as well as dedicated leadership development and training companies, it's clear that much of the external commercial and inside practitioner effort of leadership training programs, like the ones we all run, are centered around building the right recipe for effective leadership. The field has historically sought to define a set of leadership competencies, skills, and capabilities that once taught, absorbed, and embodied by learners would transform them into model leaders. Those efforts are, of course, fraught with problems, which range from the very practical, there's a lack of longitudinal validity to any of these models, to the moral. I don't think there's any reason to have to explain, I hope, how politically and socially dangerous the idea of creating one type of model leader is. But even without these social and political pitfalls, leadership research has increasingly run against trait-based development theories and shown that leader success is both contextual and episodic. Some good work by Tony Mayo on context-based leadership in 2007 outlines how leadership qualities, which seem desirable and even effective in one organizational setting or on one occasion, may be less effective in another. We all know good leaders who derail through overused strengths, and as Marshall Goldsmith reminds us, what got you here won't get you there. So instead, we've seen very wisely this growing practice in leadership training circles to encourage leaders to exhibit authenticity. This concept of leadership authenticity was really first put on the main stage for us practitioners by Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones at London Business School in their now 20-year-old text, Why Should Anybody Be Led by You? Which is a great book. I really recommend it if you haven't read it. It was just republished for their 20th, maybe 25th anniversary of that work. Anyway, in Why Should Anybody Be Led by You? Leadership authenticity is positioned as a framework, a method of prompting behaviors that are both best in the moment and grounded in the unique realness of the leader and their organization at that time. This is perhaps best captured in their motto, which is the key takeaway from their book, which is be yourself more with skill. Rob's always quick to point out when he talks to groups about this that managers or leaders are very happy for the be yourself more bit. How many of us want to be told by leadership coach, sure, just be yourself more? I don't know how many of our staffs would want to hear that story. But it's when the with skill part gets introduced that it tends to trip them up. And the concept of skill itself is kind of difficult to nail down, especially when one is looking to build skills for leadership, which is often mistakenly itself positioned as a skill. However, what's clear is that skills are embodied acts, their capabilities brought to life. There's also a point of interesting biography. Although they both were professors at London Business School, Goffey was trained as a sociologist, and Gareth Jones was head of HR for the BBC. So really, and neither disagreed with me when I told them that it was their non-traditional, for the field anyway, backgrounds, which allowed for a more contextual approach to leadership within the bigger system. All right, so pointing to the path. Several years ago, I spoke to the graduating cohort of New York Life's High Potential Leadership Program. We have an accelerated leadership program. Many of your organizations probably do as well. Ours works really well. In my remarks, I said something like, congratulations on your achievement, but I had to break some news to you. None of you can ever be a leader. And of course, the jaws drop, and the chairman's there squirming in his chair, where's this going? I said, well, you can't be a leader because leader's not like CEO, pointing to Ted, or accountant, or fire chief. It's not an office you inhabit. You can't be a leader, but you can become a leader. And you continually become a leader in those moments in which you skillfully display acts of leadership. So leader is a path, not an endpoint, right? Leader isn't something, as an office I walk into. It's when I display skillful acts of leadership, this is my thesis anyway, you can be seen as a leader. So setting out this paradigm, which we hardly embrace in New York Life anyway, that leaders do things rather than leaders are some things. We tend not to define leaders as are things. We don't have a leadership competency model, for example, in New York Life. Setting out the paradigm that leaders do rather than leaders are is a foundational mindset that I think is most important for effective leadership. What is lost, well, we believe that leaders are, is a framing that contends that leadership itself does not sit with any one individual based on organizational role or social status or physical characteristics or even innate ability. Rather, leadership should be seen as emerging through the skilled display of acts of leadership and associated learning, which is developed through feedback and reflection and mindful review of personal impact. These constitute the leadership path. This notion is supported by 3 principles I'll make about leadership itself, each of which point this further. Principle number 1, leadership is first and foremost a social act. It requires a meaningful connection to others, the basis of which is shared social practices, organizational culture, agreed, sometimes implicitly, rules for action, and standards for authority. Even though all that may seem somewhat organizationally predetermined, leaders construct their own experience and co-create the leader-follower dynamic, which must be founded, again, in shared principles, ways of acting in organizational context. Leaders have to act in ways we tell ourselves leaders should act. Simple as that. Both broadly and in the world within specific organizational context. Amazon's 14 leadership principles, been in the news lately, those wouldn't work for New York Life. Is anyone from Amazon here? Oh, good, because those rules probably don't work for Amazon either. And we've all got to set it. New York Life has this leadership profile, which we believe outline the rules for effective displays of leadership in New York Life. Very different from what Jeff Bezos says. Principle number 2, leadership is a projection towards some future outcome. So one can lead towards a goal, or a completion of an activity, or a resolution of an issue, but the outcome of leadership is always in the future. And what leaders do are create rich pictures of these futures. Okay? Principle number 3, because leadership authority is most often established by their organization, leaders are expected to shine. I'm going to use that word a couple of times. Leaders are expected to shine as exemplars of the cultures in which they lead and whose values they're expected to be promoting. Leaders embody the stories organizations tell about their culture, how we act and work, and our future, where we're headed. They interpret and clarify events and the meaning in the context of what's happening now. They shine as exemplars of how we are today and how we are meant to be. That allows followers and others, you can make a nice little pun here in English, it allows followers and others to see themselves in that light. Simply stated, leaders provide the connection between work and meaning. I've said that leadership's a way of acting rather than an assumed collection of traits, skills, or designations. Instances of leading inside organizations include highly visible actions, such as intervening to promote clarity around an issue, or resolving conflict, or organizing resources, or marshaling team members to achieve goals. You know, things managers do. And with that in mind, I'd like to take a minute and its opportunity to denounce one of the most pernicious myths promoted by the leadership development industry, big leadership. This is the myth that defines a manager as a lower life form which must be overcome in order to become a leader. You've seen these lists, right? And they're published. There was one, in writing this paper, I came across one which I detested so much, I wrote it out. It says things like, managers administer, leaders innovate. Managers copy, leaders originate. Managers rely on controls, leaders rely on trust. You get where this is going. Managers have a short-range view, leaders focus on the long term. And lastly, and famously, you've heard this before, managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. Deeply stupid quotes like, don't be a manager, be a leader, are at best misleading and at worst hurtful and demoralizing for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's hard to be a good manager. Control, resource management, organization, development, feedback, being a player coach, these are the core capabilities needed by managers, and none of those are easy. Reason number two is the manager is often the most clearly authorized source for leadership inside the organization. It's from within the role of manager that we most often expect actions of leadership to emerge. In fact, individuals are often promoted to manager because we sense some potential for leadership within them. We don't say to them, you become a leader, we put them into a manager job. So we expect managers to lead. Anyway, stop undermining your managers, which really are your most, I think, valuable source of leadership. All right, back to the main topic. In my first principle, I described the leader-follower dynamic as being co-created by those in an ongoing relationship. However, that dynamic can differ greatly based on the object of leadership. What am I leading, right? So leading John, leading the accounting department, leading this performance of Hamilton, I'm not a musician, but imagine, are very different modes of that leader-follower relationship. For example, leading the individual John points to capability associated with, for example, interpersonal relationships. Leading an organizational function, the accounting department, could point to issues of resource alignment and group dynamics. Leading a project outcome, a musical performance, consider that a project outcome, points to issues of building shared vision and enhancing team execution. However, the effective leader understands how this dynamic is built in partnership with their followers. Good leader-follower outcomes are ones in which, in the words of Robert Kelly, and one always quotes Robert Kelly here, followers are committed to something, a cause, a product, an organization, an idea, in addition to their own lives and careers. Great leaders learn to create organizations to the higher purpose of work through telling stories which link individual achievements to big organizational outcomes that are connected to mission and purpose. These are not stories of heroics. They're stories of individual bits of work. They're rich pictures which connect the dots and show how everyday work is linked to purpose-filled outcomes. These stories demonstrate how individual work, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, connects and supports the mission of the organization. We were talking about preschool in Manhattan over there. When my daughter was 3 or 4, I didn't tell this story because I wanted to save it for this as a punchline. When my daughter was 3 or 4, we lived near a university which had, and I think they still do have, a low-cost child care center. Great, you know, in Manhattan, which doubles as a child psychology research center. So in return for having some experiments performed on your kids, you get really low-cost child care, which in Manhattan is a very good deal. So anyway, when Sarah was 3 or 4, the class had a project. She's 32 now, I think. When Sarah was 3 or 4, they had a class project to grow a small vegetable patch, and the kids chose collectively to grow carrots. They also collectively, and without adult intervention, I guess that was the experiment, assigned tasks to the garden to each other. And every kid wanted the watering job because you get the hose or the pail or whatever. So, and most of them wound up disappointed. But Sarah and other kids wound up as weed pullers. And there was a large contingent of weed pullers. And she was extremely disappointed. And I remember her coming home that day, I may be exaggerating this, in my mind, but me saying something like, well, kids, suck it up. The world needs weed pullers. And her mother, taking her, who was a pediatric nurse, that's already got kids, who is a pediatric nurse still, took her to the side and said, no, let's talk about why weed pulling is going to be important for you to grow your garden. What will come from pulling those weeds, right? Okay. So the year goes by, and the parents were invited to the time of the big carrot harvest. I think they had 3 misshapen nubs of carrots, to turn up and hear their child describe the contribution that they made in growing the carrots. This is also part of the experiment, I think. So the grad student person says, kid A, what was your job? Tell us what your job was in growing our vegetable garden this year. Kid A says, I planted the seeds. Kid number 2 says, I watered the plants. Kid number 3 said, I cleaned the tools. And the grad student, turned to Sarah and said, Sarah, what was your job in the garden this year? Sarah, the weed puller, responded, I grow carrots. And I think that moment, for me, I've never been more proud of her. She's since on to become a lawyer, graduated from Ivy League school, but I think I was really proud when she was 4 and that her mother had connected the work that she was doing every day to the mission of that crappy vegetable patch. So Dan Pink, and you've all read Dan Pink, good for him, has described the value and connecting to purpose source of motivation. Dan Pink is not new. Social determination theory goes back to 1971, University of Rochester, Detchy and Ryan, if you want to read some good stuff. University of Rochester still has a human motivation lab, I think, and they do all great work there. Anyway, Pink's made the millions. What Dan Pink really does is good at telling stories around purpose. So what he does is he talks about the value of connecting purpose of something as a source of motivation. The act of saying and telling these connecting stories is an act of leadership. And one learns through practice and intentional awareness of the story's impact on others, right? The stories leaders choose to tell carry not only the links to the higher purpose of individual work, but reflect, again, shining, remember back to my other thing, what's important in the organization, its values, strategies, its aspirations. Stories do other things than align individual work to purpose. For example, stories which emphasize collective achievement support a culture of collaboration. If leaders tell stories around lessons learned from failure, it promotes psychological safety, risk tolerance, and openness to innovation. So in closing, what are the implications for leadership development and those who lead? All of you, I think. In a very everyday sense, when we as practitioners embrace the shift in our own work to build leaders who do rather than leaders who are, we're opening up a much richer space for reflection, interaction, imperfection, and growth. It forces us and our work out of the classroom or the training room and into the workplace itself, which becomes the new locus of leadership learning. Likewise, when organizations see leadership as a path of actions, the implications for leaders are clear. The leaders come to understand that leadership is not an office I walk into, I said that earlier, but an orientation to action, which connects and mobilizes others to do their best work in service of a higher purpose. I learned that serving the needs of others is of primary importance, and I learned my place as a beacon of how the organization wants to be. I thank you for your attention.